client about what are the risks. Are there risks?
You know what? I'm going to stop you.
Okay.
Welcome to Real Life Real Estate, Suzanne's Real Life Real Estate. The purpose behind this podcast is to introduce to listeners, people in this community that offer services and information about things available to you. And I'm very happy that my frequent guest, attorney JAIME Thomas, is with me today to talk about something you may find interesting.
Thank you.
Rental properties. Before we get into that, I want to just remind everyone that the Regional Food Bank of Northeastern New York, always looking for donations, and as little as $1 can provide 4 meals. So if you are inclined that you may want to give to the food bank, you can always call me at 518-577-6571, or you can email me at sprezio@cbpp.com. That's for Coldwell Banker Prime Properties. So you can email me or call me or even send me a text, and I'll help you find a way to get that donation to the food bank, because you see it a lot around Thanksgiving, but people are hungry all year round. So if you can give, great. So JAIME.
Suzanne.
Hi. It's a spring-like February day.
Surprising.
Right? I often have people say, hey, wouldn't it be great to buy a house and have my tenant help pay the mortgage?
That's a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
And there are pitfalls and things to be careful of in that situation, like any other real estate purchase. In the last several years, the state of New York has changed the laws quite a bit to make it much riskier than it used to be. The idea is every month you'll get a check from your tenant, may subsidize your mortgage, may just make your budget work for that month, may make you break even for the month. Starting out, that's typically the case. The small 2-family house landlord isn't getting wealthy. They're treading water, and it's a good way to get into a starter home, right? But New York's done some things to make that extremely risky, and any buyer who's considering that as an option has to know what could go wrong.
So as of June of 2019,
Right.
there were some fancy revisions to the rental laws,
Yes.
which I just want to point out to our listeners do apply to upstate New York.
Statewide.
I have many friends that are landlords, and they are saying, when I say to them, listen, I can send these laws over to you, or I have, somebody if you want to talk to them, you know what, the laws apply to everyone within New York State. It's not just a New York City thing.
And the legislators that made the laws, I think, are primarily from the city, from downstate, and gave no thought to how they would have an effect in the more suburban or smaller cities or rural areas, but they all apply equally everywhere throughout the state. The first thing that happened in 2019 was the state made evictions much more difficult and extended the period of time that it would take to remove a problem tenant.
What was it prior to this, if you needed to evict someone?
In the past, if starting with typically every tenant would get who got evicted, it would be a non-payment situation. Generally, landlords weren't evicting tenants for any other reason. There are certainly evictions where there is a problem other than non-payment, but the vast majority is it's February 5th, you didn't pay your rent, it was due on the 1st. That's the problem. So in the good old days, you'd give a tenant a 3-day notice. They don't pay the rent on the 1st, on the 2nd, you give them a 3-day notice. Pay the rent in 3 days, or you have to leave.
As of when?
After 3 days, that's your time is up.
Oh, not even the end of the month.
Well, no, not even the end of the month. However,
Oh.
it sounds harsh. So if the tenant doesn't leave after 3 days, in the old days, you still have to go to court. You won't get into court for at least 2 weeks, even under the friendlier rules. So you get your 3-day notice, you get another 2 weeks. So we're 17 days before we get to court. So now we're at, say, the 18th, 19th, 20th of the month. you get to court, and if things go smoothly, and if the tenant still can't pay the rent, the judge will issue a warrant of eviction. The warrant of eviction would go to the sheriff, who delivers it to the occupant, and then would give the occupant 3 more days. That last step, getting a warrant from the court, the warrant's a court order, you have to leave. The sheriff enforces it. Here's the court order that says you have to leave. That's probably a 10-day process. So under the really fast old rules, it would take a month to have a tenant evicted using the proper court proceedings.
Average cost to the landlord for that process.
So say it's February, you don't get your $1,000 rent for February, you pay your lawyer $750, say your court costs another $100, $859. So you'll be about $2,000 in the hole.
You pay the sheriff?
You pay the sheriff, also gets $100 in change.
That's all? The sheriff who has to physically remove the people from the house?
Yes, that's
for
the
$100.
sheriff's, right. And usually, if it ever gets that far, it's the educated tenant who knows, wait till the sheriff comes, have everything lined up, and then leave. So rarely does a tenant get physically removed by the sheriff. Just the more informed tenants wait till the end and then say, oh, I got a place, and go. The landlord, meanwhile, is out $2,000. Maybe you get a money judgment under the old rules against the tenant. Maybe the tenant has a job and you can garnish their wages. Most landlords never see that money. You're out that $2,000. So if you needed the rent for February, you're gonna have to get it from somewhere else, or the mortgage payment. If you needed the mortgage payment for March, because you're not gonna have a new tenant March 1st. So that's probably 2 months, another $1,000, so maybe $3,000 you're behind. And who knows what's happening with your mortgage? If your mortgage is, $1,000, $1,500, $2,000 a month, you have to keep paying your mortgage, even though you don't have the rent income coming in. Those were considered landlord-friendly rules. New York changed those rules to say that you can't give a notice to move until after 5 days, and then you've got to give a 14-day notice. So you have to first send one notice that just says you owe rent in a couple sentences, but basically it doesn't give any warning or notice. It just says you owe rent, you didn't pay it. You can't make any warning of what you're going to do.
A written notice.
A written notice. All the notices now have to be written. You can't give any verbal notices anymore.
Certified?
Your first notice that says you didn't pay your rent has to be by certified mail.
So my tenant that lives next door, I have to send him a
You got to send
certified
them
letter.
you can't hand it to them. You
Okay.
could, but you still have to send it certified.
Okay.
Even if you hand that person a notice,
Okay,
you also have to send it by certified mail.
okay.
That's just a 5-day notice. You didn't pay your rent. You also have to send off 14-day notice. And that doesn't have to be by certified mail. That you can tape to the door or mail it, deliver it any way you want to get it to them. It's a strange rule. The meaningless notice has to be sent certified mail.
Okay.
Then you send a 14-day notice before you can do anything. That is, go to court. So you send your 14-day notice. They didn't pay on the 1st. You got to wait till about the 5th before you can send the 14-day notice. So now we're at the 20th, and you still haven't done anything to get the case into court. Now you can start talking about filing a petition to go to court, and you've got to give the tenant at least 14 days notice before their court date. So your whole first month is gone, and you're not even in court. You can't get into court now until the second month, which if they didn't pay February, they're not going to pay March. So you get into court on March 1st, the tenant can come in and say, can I have some more time? I'm not prepared, or just, can I have some more time? And the required answer is yes, you can have 14 more days. So we'll be 6 weeks from the date the first payment was made before we see a judge, when the judge might do something. And if the tenant comes back again and says, I've got issues, some convinces the judge, you might get another 14 days. So you're 2 months unpaid rent. That's what the expedited, that's the fast procedure now. That's 6 months to 8 months, 6 weeks to 8 weeks before you get your court date. And then the judge is going to consider, is the rent paid? Then there'll be a hearing to find out, did that tenant pay the rent or not pay the rent? But you can't get attorney's fees. Your old leases used to say, if the tenant makes me go through this process, they'll have to pay my attorney. The judge can't give you that anymore. All you can get is the rent. So you could find that after 2 months, the tenant walks in and says, Judge, I've got the rent. Here's the rent. And the judge will order you to accept it, but only the rent, not your attorney's fees, not your court costs, process server, sheriff. No, you get no money back. You only get the base rent that the tenant didn't pay, but you get it 2 months late. And then the judge will dismiss the petition. And who knows what'll happen the following month.
Mhm.
So that way you got all your rent, but you're maybe $1,000 to $1,500 behind in expenses, court costs, and attorney's fees. So that's what a non-paying tenant could do to our young couple maybe who bought their first home. It's a 2-family home and couldn't pay the mortgage for 2 months because of the situation with their tenant. Now, if they want to use that money to catch up their mortgage, they're still going to owe the bank penalties, interest, expenses, whatever the bank gets all their money.
Right, bank
You
always
did-
wins.
Right. You didn't get all your money from the tenant, but you still have to pay the bank everything the bank is owed. And it can get worse. That's 2 months is a optimistic scenario where you don't have any difficulties with the tenant and the judge agrees with you. And then COVID came along and now we're under COVID rules.
Which
So,
are,
starting in April, the COVID rules were nobody can evict any tenant for any reason. Tenants can stay. So if your tenant didn't pay April's rent or May or any month from then till now, you cannot go to court to get a court order removing that tenant. They can stay there. It's relatively indefinite now. In January, the procedure is that you can file a eviction proceeding and get into court sometime in February. But if the tenant comes in and says, I'm affected by COVID, the judge has to give that tenant until May 1st.
well, who isn't affected by COVID?
It's a very soft requirement. The tenant has to swear under oath that in some form they were affected by COVID, but it's not very strenuous. It's not a heavy lift for the tenant to show that they've been negatively affected by COVID. Here's some of the choices. Significant loss of household income during COVID. It doesn't have to be related to COVID. Could be you were bad at your job and you got fired. That's good enough for not paying your rent. You can stay. If you had an increase in out-of-pocket expenses related to performing essential work during the COVID pandemic, your expenses went up. They don't have to be related to COVID. Your expense increase does not have to be related to COVID. But if it happened during COVID, you get a couple extra months. These aren't hard things to say.
Right.
If you're caring for an elderly person, if that got more expensive during COVID, you can stay longer. But when does caring for another person not get more expensive? Right? I don't think it ever gets cheaper. Same thing would apply to childcare expenses. If during COVID it got more expensive to take care of kids, well, when does it not get more expensive to take care of kids?
I'm waiting.
So
Waiting to find
you
out.
can stay till May. Moving expenses, if it would be expensive to find a new place during COVID, you don't have to move. So of course it is. It's not easy. So there's a handful of funny outs, but all the tenants got to do is swear under oath to any of these fairly simple statements, and they can stay till May. The way it's written now is the law may provide certain protections by May 1st that aren't available now. It is written into the rules from
These new rules
the
that
new
just
rules.
came out, when did they come out?
in January.
Okay,
So these came out at end of December, effective January, but just extending everything right through May. I think that what they're saying is that, what the state is saying is they're gonna change the rules again by May 1st. And I think they're gonna extend the period of time when it's hard to evict any tenant. They repeat several times that the tenant still owes the rent, but landlords know and learned and will continue to learn over the years, when you have a tenant not paying rent, it's unlikely you'll ever get that rent. If they're having problems financially, they probably will never have the ability to pay you the rent that you're owed. So for the state's rules to say the tenant still owes the rent, well, yes, but they're never going to get it.
And if I'm understanding this correctly, there's really no way for the landlord to protect themselves because they can no longer ask for references, correct?
Oh, yeah, there's all kinds of restrictions on what
they
you can ask a tenant.
Can't do a credit check.
Right.
Um,
For now, you can still ask for a guarantee. So if you find a tenant who has a relative who's more financially able, you might ask them, say, I want your relative to guarantee that you'll pay the rent. If you don't pay the rent, then we can ask whoever the guarantor is, the relative, to pay the rent for you.
all right, so if they had to go that avenue, what's the recourse there? I mean, bring that person to court?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
And then that person doesn't pay either?
Well,
or is that different?
No, that's where you want a financially responsible guarantor.
Well,
the problem is it's hard to find. A lot of tenants just don't have somebody who could do that.
but I mean, I don't, and I mean, I get, people fall on hard times and
Mhm.
such, but it seems to me like some people were actually making more money during COVID. They were collecting unemployment that was
Right.
more than what they would have made.
Right.
Stimulus checks came in. It was money that, maybe should have gone toward rent instead of other things. And the landlord can't say to the judge, hey, look, so what I guess my question is on top of this is, so that person doesn't, so then you bring in the grantor, that's what it's called?
Guarantor.
Guarantor.
Well, I think you skip the tenant. You just go straight to the guarantor, this financially responsible person, and say, you sign this paper, you owe me the rent. I'm not going after the tenant. I'm just going to keep coming to you and I'll sue you if necessary, because I know you have the money to pay me.
But do you have, I guess where I'm confused is you don't really have any recourse against the tenant, but you do against this other person?
If
This
they
will
will
actually,
sign and guarantee, somebody like Suzanne, who might have a son who is young and getting an apartment, the landlord might say, Suzanne, I want you to guarantee that your son will pay the rent. Sign here. I'm not renting to him unless you, Suzanne, guarantee you will pay your son's rent if he doesn't, because he's young and has no experience.
okay,
But that's an option. However, not every tenant has a responsible person like you who can guarantee payment of their rent.
okay.
But it's things like that. It takes creative solutions. But if you're that person considering buying a 2-family home, you really want to think about it in 2021. If you need that rental income to balance your budget each month.
Because I know we had talked about like protecting the owner, and I know landlord I think is a term that, a lot of times people think, the bad landlords in the city that, people don't have heat and such. A lot of times the landlord is the owner, and it's a young couple or it's an elderly person or it's somebody who's just always rented out this,
There are a lot of 2-family
and
homes in Albany, in Troy, in Schenectady, where the owner lives there and needs the rent from the tenant to balance the books every month, to pay the mortgage, buy groceries maybe.
right.
And all these rules apply to that person living in a home and renting their apartment.
So even owner occupied,
Even
there's
owner
still,
occupied,
there's nothing you can do.
you're stuck.
Because I know before we had talked about maybe protecting yourself with not doing a year lease, but just doing a month to month.
I'd always
even that-
almost always recommend a month-to-month
But-
tenancy, but under these rules,
It's moot.
it's moot, right? Whether it's a lease or a month-to-month tenant, if they're not paying the rent, your options are the same. They've always been the same, but now those options are very few. It's very difficult. The Times Union had an article on January 25th by Amanda Fries. The headline is "Landlords allege tenants have money but refuse to pay rent." And that's, if you could probably Google that and find it on the Times Union website. It's a landlord saying that his tenant has been taking vacations during COVID, but not paying the rent. And the tenant doesn't say much in response. He doesn't admit it, but they interviewed the tenant and he's had very little to say. So that's an interesting article if anyone wants to read a perspective from a landlord. And then the other thing the state did, the state legislature, is enact a law criminalizing landlords' conduct effective the same time, June of 2014, making it a crime called unlawful eviction. The act shall be known and may be cited as the statewide Housing Security and Tenant Protection Act of 2019. So there are procedures for a landlord to provide notices to a tenant if eviction is warranted. This law makes it criminal for the landlord to, if the tenant claims they don't owe the rent, the tenant can go to the police, say, my landlord's trying to evict me, but I don't owe rent. So instead of defending the eviction, go get the landlord arrested. So I have my clients in the mid-70s who now has a criminal case pending against her locally for unlawful eviction.
So you've actually seen this. This has actually come across
I
your
have
desk.
the case pending, yeah.
Wow.
And it is the grandmother who's the landlord, and the tenant actually has moved out. But now grandma's got to answer the complaint in court. And the allegations against her in that case are knocking on the door, asking the tenant if she's moving out. When the unit was empty, asking her, have you moved out? Those were the basis for the complaints by the tenant that the landlord had unlawfully evicted her.
Now, are the banks working with homeowners on this, or are the banks
Well,
just?
the banks are nobody's going to defend the banks, but they've got a pause button pushed too on foreclosures.
They do. Okay.
So yeah, so they can't foreclose, but that's worse than the landlord situation, because the landlord, there's a pause button on your mortgage payments, but those are never going away.
Right.
There is a chance the state legislature is going to make some kind of moratorium or erase all of this unpaid rent, just absolve all these tenants who haven't paid rent for a year and declare that it's forgiven.
But the homeowner is still going to be
But the homeowner's still got to pay
incurring
that mortgage.
all these fees and penalties for late mortgage, and
that's not going to go away whether the landlord gets any money or not.
wow, that's really something to think about then.
So if we have a person considering a one unit, a 2-family house, one rental income and living there, it's not a great idea right now. Even if you have a relative who's going to rent it, that could go bad too.
that could make Thanksgiving uncomfortable, because family. I love my family, but business and family is sometimes not a good recipe.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think this is? I know you don't have a crystal ball. Well, unless we're at a party and you bring that out. But
I have an opinion.
Do you think it's going to turn around?
No, I think it'll get worse before it gets better, because the same people are making the rules. The state legislature, there hasn't been any turnover in the state legislature. So the same people who enacted the rules in 2019 and then a year later made the COVID rules, they're still making the rules. So I think it's an economic issue that they aren't concerned with. They're not concerned with the economics of a landlord, what the landlord's problems might be when the tenant stops paying the rent. I think the implicit in all of these laws is that the landlord will always be fine financially because he's a landlord or she's a landlord. But the tenant, you got to protect the tenant. The landlord doesn't need any protections. I've been waiting for one of the landlord groups to start a lawsuit to challenge the statutes, because they're laser focused on landlords.
Yeah, well, there's no balance there. I mean, it's a one-sided
Well, the state
proposal.
legislatures decided that this is how we want the playing field to be. And if you're a landlord, it's uphill. They tilted the playing field, so you're going uphill both ways.
Wow, that's a risk.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think the bigger landlords who they maybe were targeting,
well, who they were,
if
yeah.
they've got 100 units and, whatever percentage is not productive, you're going to raise the rent on the other units. So what you're going to do is make the paying tenants pay more.
Now, didn't that law, and I could be wrong, regulate how rents can be raised?
5% per year. If you want more than that, you have to justify why you want more than a 5% increase. And that's a tough rule too. I'm sure nobody wants to raise rents, or have their rent raised. But as if the property taxes go up 10% a year, which has happened, the landlord's expenses aren't a factor.
Wow. Well, we'll have to revisit this come May.
I'm curious,
So-
to see if this gets finally wrapped up or made permanent.
All right, well, clear your calendar and we'll get you back in May. I appreciate you coming on today. I do.
It's always fun, Suzanne.
Again, it's Attorney Jamie Thomas, and I have a question for you before I let you
Okay.
go. What did you want to be when you grew up?
That's a funny truck driver, bus driver, something. Drive a big machine.
Okay, all right. That must,
Didn't work out though.
I have a friend, Dennis, who was just buses. It was all about school
Yeah.
buses. Loves them.
Yeah.
So wow, that is not what I thought was going to come out of your
Yeah,
mouth.
yeah,
You
yeah.
never cease to surprise me.
I am
So,
amazing.
All right. Well, again, Jamie Thomas, thank you, and we'll
Thank
see
you,
you.
Suzanne.
We'll see you soon.